Consider supporting this podcast on Patreon. On this episode of the What is Asia podcast, I interview Matyas Mervay, a history Ph.D. candidate at New York University and an adjunct professor of East Asian history at Adelphi University in New York, to talk about Central European refugees living in Republican China. Matyas, thanks for coming on this episode of the What is Asia podcast.
Thanks for inviting me.
So if you could just start out by explaining to people, what are you researching? And if you could also talk about the historical context around this period that you're researching.
Yeah, sure. So broadly speaking, I'm working on 19th and 20th century East Asian and modern Central European history. And so my research is really about trying to make a connection between these two regions. East Central Europe being the former territories of the Habsburg Empire, and East Asian history. In East Asian history, I'm largely focusing on China. More specifically, I'm looking at it. This is also my where my dissertation is focusing on, is early 20th century Republican Chinese history and diplomatic relations between these two regions that I mentioned.
Mm-hmm. And can you go into a little bit more detail around, well, what is the argument that you're making? What are you trying to demonstrate through your research?
Yeah, of course. So a couple of things. It's my research is focusing on two main topics. One is, as I mentioned, the diplomatic history between the two regions, and the other one is diaspora history, specifically speaking, refugee diasporas from the Central European region living in Republican China. So what my research is really about is to observe these communities living mostly in Shanghai, but also in other cities such as Harbin or Tianjin, Chinese coastal and other cities with colonial background. And I'm looking at these communities originally from the Austro-Hungarian Empire with various ethnic backgrounds, including Austrian, Czech, Hungarian, and some other ethnic groups from this region, and how they organized themselves when they, for whatever reason, they found themselves in the territory of China, or what we know as China today. Since in this time it's not a unified country, it's a fragmented and multiple sovereignties that we might going to talk about. So what I'm showing in my dissertation is that these refugee communities who ended up finding asylum in Republican era China actually had significance in a couple of ways. One is these Austro-Hungarian refugees who ended up living in China because they arrived as former prisoners of war during World War I through the Russian territories. They actually provided the first opportunity for the Republican Chinese government to deal with foreign refugee groups, and therefore they could demonstrate their capability to deal with such a problem and prove to the international community that they are a modern country. On the other hand, these people who formerly arrived as refugee soldiers and settled in China later themselves became community organizers. And during World War II, Jewish refugees would arrive from Nazi-occupied Europe. They would be able to organize refugee relief for these Jewish refugees, most notably in Shanghai in the late 1930s.
Something that my audience might be wondering is, well, okay, so you have these refugees who are leaving Central Europe. Why China? And then also, as an appendage to that question, can you talk about the actual means in which they're getting there? Are they traveling there by road, by sea, by plane? How is that the actual act of migration actually happening?
Yeah, of course. So I mentioned two group of refugees just now, starting with the first one, also chronologically speaking. During World War One, these prisoners of war, originally from the territories of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, they end up being captive soldiers and transported in different parts of the Russian Empire. So mostly those POWs who end up in the far eastern territories of the Russian Empire, whenever they had a chance to flee their camps, or at latest during the Russian Civil War in the early 1920s, following the Bolshevik Revolution, and the camps would open up and chaotic circumstances would allow them to leave these former prisoner of war camps. They would either leave on foot if they are lucky enough, they survive the Cossack patrols in the taiga, or just the cold weather, or by the Chinese Manchurian borderland, the Amur tigers attacks, and they would somehow end up in Chinese territories. First, obviously, Manchuria, the Chinese Northeast. Some of them could take advantage of the Chinese Eastern Railway, which is a portion of the Trans-Siberian Railroad. Some of you might be familiar with this. Originally part of the Russian railway expansionism, and it's a segment and runs through the Manchurian territories, and some of these ex-POWs could actually travel by those trains. So that's a common way to arrive to China from the Northeast for these POWs. The other group that I mentioned, some 15, 20 years later, during World War II, would chiefly arrive to Shanghai and other Chinese port cities with steamers, commercial lines usually. So usually they would buy with the last money that they had, they were able to buy a ticket, a Transocean ticket in Europe, and they hope they make it to Shanghai, and that's how they arrived. So these are the two main ways to get, and anybody else in between these two refugee groups, because Shanghai and other Chinese cities at that time are very attractive, especially in the 1920s, for people having hard times finding a job during the Great Depression or other economic difficulties in Europe. They would take these ships from Europe and arrive in China.
One thing that's interesting about your project is that you look at this in the framework of international relations. And I'm wondering, what were the reactions of, for example, the Russian Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, when China was taking on these refugees? You talk about how it was important to China because it sort of demonstrated their sovereignty, it sort of demonstrated their modernity as a modern nation. But what were the various reactions to China taking on these refugees from, like I said, countries like Austria or Russia?
Yeah, so this is obviously an era when the Qing Empire, the last Chinese empire, has just collapsed after 1911, and China's leader decided to join World War I on the Allied side, hoping that by choosing the Entente, the Allied side, they will get better deals, and eventually they are going to have better positions in the international stage than their great rival at that time, Japan, who also is fighting on the same side in World War I. So this is the context of these first group of refugees arrival. in the first couple of years of the Great War, China is still neutral. So those refugees who arrive to China, they fall under the Geneva Convention's regulations. So China is showing its modernity by obeying those rules, and treats them as a third country soldiers who want to find asylum in its place. And after 1917, when China joins the war, these already interned soldiers automatically become, these soldiers who arrived as refugees automatically become interned soldiers, and anybody else after 1917 arriving to China are treated as enemy subjects. So me looking at these Chinese sources in these years between 1915 to 1921, approximately in these years, governmental sources and Manchurian provincial officials and their correspondence, what seems to be clear is that Chinese authorities are not really clear who these people are and where they exactly are from. There's a great confusion, especially in the Northeast on the provincial level. They understand that these people are not Russians. They are quite familiar with Russia because of the vicinity. They understand that they are not speaking English or French, other two common languages that some more educated Chinese officials would be familiar with. They usually put all these people under the category of Germans, which is obviously a broad generalization. It's much more complicated, but it's true that the German is the language, the only one probably they could communicate with if one of the Chinese officials actually they find someone who speaks German. So this is really the level of knowledge on the provincial level. And of course, on the governmental level, they decided to join the war, so they know where Austria-Hungary is. But there, in general, I could say China doesn't really have any stake in the war against the continental powers. Against Germany, yes, because of the well-known story of the Shandong leased territory that is held by Germany. So Germany has large colonial territories in China. So China has an interest to go against Germany in the war, but not against Austria-Hungary. It's really insignificant. There was a in Tianjin, in the northern port city, there was a Austro-Hungarian concessional territory that is de facto a colony held by Austro-Hungary in Chinese territory, but that is really not a reason enough for China to go to war against Austro-Hungary. So what I mean to say is that China has really nothing against the Austro-Hungarian Empire and its subjects. So that's the way these people get treated most of the time, with ignorance about their conditions and also as a general indifference, I would say. Later on, so in the 1920s and 30s, people from this region, from the Central European region, arriving to China could have different relations, as China also enters the war with Japan and through the League of Nations tries to negotiate with the Western powers. And so, of course, the Austro-Hungarian Empire falls apart after World War I. So this region becomes home of small ethnic, small nation states such as Czechoslovakia, Austria, Hungary, and other countries. And these countries are having their own specific relations with the new Chinese Republic. And that is not the same as previous in the colonial times. And if you're interested, we can talk about those diplomatic relations too. But in general, there are two kinds of attitudes in the Central European countries towards China. Is one that is able to secure some kind of economic commercial treaty with China, and therefore they have some sort of very pragmatic relation, and others who don't at all, and basically they never established relationship in the period up until 1949, when the communists take over, and most Eastern European countries will have actually very close connection with communist China. But in this period, there is little interaction, and therefore the Chinese government has very little to say about those people who arrive to its territories, besides the fact that they are foreigners, they are non-colonial foreigners, and we have to somehow deal with the administration task that they pose.
I'd like to take the conversation in a slightly different direction. So one of the things that you mentioned in the materials that you'd sent me is you talk about how this intake of refugees from Austria-Hungary has or had prepared in a way China for this inflow of Jewish Holocaust refugees. Can you talk a little bit about in what ways did this first wave of Austro-Hungarians during the First World War, how did it prepare the mechanisms that China needed for this intake of Jews from Europe in World War II?
Yeah, so this is something that that definitely had effect on the Chinese attitudes towards foreigners. I would say actually in limited ways, such as just general knowledge about this region and its people. So as I mentioned, during World War I, they were basically very much ignorant about the conditions from an ethnic and linguistic, etc. background where these people are coming from and they have to deal with now as refugees in China. But that changes, and in the interwar and during World War II that you are asking about, they had some rough ideas, basically due to this past 2 decades of international negotiations through the League of Nations. So what I would say is this general kind of information and knowledge that the first wave of refugees brought to China that contributed to the image of what is Central Europe, what is East Central Europe in the Chinese eyes. In other ways, the connection between these two refugee groups and sort of the preparation of the Chinese environment to intake and to deal with the refugees during World War II, the Jewish refugees, namely, actually largely can be observed in the Shanghai foreign community. So, of course, as we know, in this period, Shanghai is not really a Chinese city, or let me say, not only a Chinese city. It is divided into spheres of influence, settlements, and concessions of the Western powers, and that changes somewhat during the Japanese occupation of Shanghai and Eastern China, but still not under Chinese jurisdiction largely, unless we count the puppet government that is, of course, a Chinese puppet government, but influenced heavily by the Japanese. So in these conditions, there are Central European community leaders who are already living in Shanghai. Let me mention one name, someone who is really famous among survivors of this era, and now the second generation of Jewish refugees who were brought up in Shanghai as children or brought as very young adults by their parents from Europe and spent years in Shanghai during World War II. They would all remember one community leader whose name was Paul Komor, originally a Hungarian Jew, but basically spent his whole life, most of his life in Shanghai. And he started his career, apart from being a successful businessman, he started his social philanthropic career by helping ex-POWs during World War I and after World War I. And so this Paul Komor, during the 1920s and 1930s, helps all these former prisoners of war to stand up on their own in a financial sense and be able to fend for themselves, and has an association he founds. And during World War II, when the Jewish refugees arrive, basically he becomes this committee organizer that is named after him, It's known by two names: International Committee or just simply Comor Committee. And this Comor Committee is responsible for thousands of Jewish refugees, to save thousands of Jewish refugees in Shanghai. So this is one example, and probably the most notable example of how there's a connection between these refugee groups, is how people are able to help each other coming from the same region, and how this experience of the first refugees actually allows during a larger influx of refugees to just basically set up these very basic philanthropic and charity structures that saves at the end about 20,000 lives in Shanghai.
I just have a couple more questions before we wrap up. One question that I like to ask a lot of guests sort of connects the past to the present. Can you talk a little bit about, during the course of doing your research, how in China this phenomenon of refugees during World War I coming into China is looked at today, retrospectively in China? Like, how is it talked about in history books? If you're just in casual conversation with people or scholars, how do they talk about it? And as an extension to this question, with history, we're always being asked to sort of justify what's the point of why we're doing this. So what would you say if someone were to forget every single thing that you said during this podcast? What would be the one practical lesson that we could learn from this that you would want them to take away?
Yeah, so starting with your first question, to what extent this history is known in China or by Chinese scholars, the short answer is very little. There are only very few publications that touch upon the Austro-Hungarian prisoners of war arriving to China. It is also due to the fact that there is relatively little, although a growing literature now is coming up on the subject of China's participation in World War I. There are some notable names there. Basically, the idea is that World War I is an opportunity for China to engage with the international community, and this is how I also see the refugee question being significant for China, as I mentioned in the beginning, to demonstrate its modernity. I would say that the whole question of Central European refugee diasporas and their history in the Republican Chinese era is significant. It could be significant for many, is to learn about a connection between two regions that nowadays, and I'm really talking about the past 5-10 years, is growing important, is becoming important. So China is becoming very much influential in the Eastern European region. And it's pretty well known what happened between the two regions after 1949 during the communist Eastern Bloc cooperations. But virtually nothing is known about the period that preceded this. And I think by looking at these diaspora communities in an era when there was no formal diplomatic relations between the two regions, we can understand some of the continuities and some of the initial phases of these of the nature of these connections by studying this Republican era connections. Also for scholars of East Asian studies and for Chinese studies, this is going to be a contribution that is virtually also unknown due to the linguistic difficulties. Being able to read Eastern European languages is not usually is not an asset usually for China scholars or for East Asian scholars, and it highlights many of the important questions of the Republican era in Chinese history.
What would be one or two books that you recommend someone read pertaining to refugees coming to China, or just this period of Republican China and its connection to international relations? What would be one or two books that you'd recommend?
I would definitely recommend the books. Each author that I'm going to mention has at least a couple of books on the subject. One of them is the American author Marsha Ristaino, who wrote about Russian and Jewish refugee communities in China in this period. And the other one would be the German Israeli sinologist Irena Eber, who not only published studies on this subject, mostly the Jewish refugee relief in Shanghai, but also published a great documentary collection of primary sources.
Great, Matthias, thanks for coming on this episode of the What is Asia podcast.
Thank you, Nagoya, for inviting me. Thank you so much, and good luck with your podcast.
And for those who want to see more content, you can go to the What is Asia podcast YouTube channel or NakotaDefonso.com. We'll see you in the next episode.